Welcome, Caroline, from the Emergency News Channel. Emergency News Channel is a group on Telegram where Caroline has been collating scientific and credible data to compile what she calls the boom maps for the UK and Ireland, and in fact around the world, and charts booms and also unusual weather phenomena scientifically. So, look, thank you very much for joining us, Caroline. Caroline, can you talk us through what are Thank you. What are the boom maps and what do you cover with them?
Well, we started back in 2021, just noticing a few odd things, and I thought, well, maybe it would be a good idea to just record all of this so we can see if there are any patterns. And I don't know whether you remember, there was a European football match, and England were playing, and all the children in the UK in England were allowed to stay up late that night. And it was very strange because they were allowed to go late into school the next day. And I don't know if you know about England and schools, but you just don't take any time off at all. You get reprimanded. So it was really unusual. And that night we predicted that there would be a lot of booms, like kind of audible booms in the sky, gunfire, possibly things that sounded like fireworks. And probably we recorded on a tweet when it was still Twitter about 50, 60 entries. I may be exaggerating a little, but on our channels, on Telegram and on Twitter, what is now X, we recorded a lot of data. And so we decided to start plotting those on a map and seeing if there were kind of patterns, So it did seem that certain areas of the UK and Ireland were being affected more than others. But as time went on and we were adding to the same map, it got so ridiculous you could hardly see the map in some areas. So, for example, the southwest, Bristol, Bath area, Wales, South Wales, a little bit of Cornwall, all of the south coast, all of the ports, port towns, the cities as well. So Manchester, Birmingham, London, the big cities, Edinburgh and Glasgow, and a lot of the southeast as well, and the east coast. So it just literally, no area was left untouched by the end of it. Anything that was populated, we, over a course of probably about 8 months, we managed to track a boom in all of these areas, all of them. Unbelievable.
What do you think is happening underground? What are these booms?
Well, from what we can tell now, and I can talk you through how we've come to that conclusion, we are pretty certain, and coupling that with, live recordings of gunfire, we think there are fights going on underground, proper battles between military forces.
And who are the military forces, do you think?
So there are two schools of thought. Obviously, there's the school of thought that nothing's going on underground for the people who sleep very, very heavily and are not at all affected by any of this. Then there's the school of thought that all our governments are trying to kill us. So I kind of like, well, I'm not sure why they would be fighting people in the middle of the night underground if they were trying to kill us. And then there's the school of thought that there are non-allied troops. So by allies, I mean countries like the US, UK, Canada, and all of the Western European countries, the original ones after the war, World War II, and then countries possibly like Japan. But as we've discussed already, I think that there are possibly factions within those countries, smaller than the actual military troops that we have, who are acting on behalf of and as proxies for our enemy, in inverted commas. And the enemy could could include Putin, of course, because we're seeing this, live on TV with Ukraine, and all of the other factions that are attached to Russia. So, for example, the axis of resistance in the Middle East, which includes the umbrellas countries of Iran. So Iran is at the center, and then you have the Houthis, sorry, not countries, but factions. But they are in particular countries. So the Houthis are in Yemen, and in Gaza you have Hamas, and in Lebanon you have Hezbollah, and there are numerous more that I've covered in some of my writing. So not only that, but globally you have an extensive list. I don't know whether you've been on to see how many rebel factions we have globally. There are many all across Africa, South America, and then there are the cartels and the drug lords and the gangs, and just the list goes on. Literally anybody you can think of that is involved with criminal activity, trafficking weapons and humans and everything. Anybody involved in that would be involved somehow, potentially, in this war against the Allies.
So that's, I think I hear it's sort of generally called the deep state.
I wouldn't call it that, because that implies that it is a layer across all countries. And I don't think it necessarily is. That implies that we knowingly allow a shadow government, for example. Each country allows a shadow government to take that. And I don't think that's happening. I don't think that happens at all. I think there are factions within governments who are trying to manipulate the outcome of things, certainly. But I would liken them to really infiltrators. Does that make sense?
Yes, but it's interesting because I think people have some people have different sort of takes on sort of who are the allies and who are the deep state guys. And that seems to vary from person to person, and it's difficult to actually work out. I mean, we had a sort of James Tunney, the barrister, and he did an awful lot of work with what's called the Third Secret of Fatima, which was so it was some children that were Mary had sort of revealed herself to, back in the 1920s or 1940s, and but she'd revealed at that time that she thought that actually Russia were going to be the saviors of the planet, and so it's interesting because there's some people that really have Russia and Putin in sort of in high esteem for his work. So it's I think it's interesting to hear other people's perspectives, because it keeps everybody sort of questioning sort of, well, what's right and what's wrong. And it's interesting even at the moment that all of those ships are in the Middle East, but that's a conversation for another day, because it's like, well, what are we dealing with over there? So, but again, so that's a conversation for another day. But look, so what do you see with these tunnels? What are these tunnels generally used for? Where are they, and how deep are they?
So this is a question we get asked all the time, and I think if you look, and I've got a number of apps open at any given time, and I've got them up on my screen now so that I can tell you about them. So the first map that we use to see what is going on underground, we kind of hope is exactly what's going on underground, is something called Zoom Earth. And it has a layer for heat spots, but it also has a layer for live fires over ground. So anything that doesn't show as a live fire but shows as a heat spot is underground, without a doubt it's underground. And we've had people, when they hadn't tweaked the app, basically they tweaked the app, realizing that some of our teams were going off to go and have a look at these different sites to have a nose. And one of the sites near London, somebody visited and they saw military fire guys there on site. There was no fire overground, but heat was coming up and smoke was coming up out of the ground. So we know for certain that those heat spots, and this reflected on the heat map, so we knew it was there. And it was a very, very strong one. So we know that these heat spots are reflective of something going on underground. Whether or not it is indicative of an actual heat at a certain depth, or that it is just a vague marker for a heat spot, I don't know. And I would hope that they'd have some way of translating, I don't know, infrared scanning or whatever they use. And I think this is by Eumostat, Meteostat and firms. So they have obviously a lot of data to draw from. That would be more or less accurate in terms of intensity. So, for example, we will see a heat spot appear and it will be very strong and very red and very noticeable. And then over the days, it will fade. And what they do is they refresh the heat layer, I don't know, once or twice a day, depending on where you are, and you will be able to see in real time how, where this activity is going. So you might see a heat spot, for example, in the southeast of the UK, and then the next day you'll see some around London, and then the next day you'll see some a little bit further north. So we know that that's a good indicator that something has happened. In 2022, we had the heat dome over England. I don't know whether you experienced it, but it was extreme heat. Where we are quite close to an RAF base, and they recorded the hottest temperature ever recorded in the UK, well over 40 degrees. It was very, very hot. But at the same time, we knew that heat dome was accompanied by all this weird activity in the sky that I've told you about, kind of odd flights, repetitive, and going over certain areas again and again and again. And this dome was accompanied by that kind of activity. And if you know anything about gas, certain gases tend to rise. So hot air rises and will take a lot of the toxins with it. And as air cools, it will drop. So that the heat will have helped keep things up in the air a little bit higher than they would do otherwise. But what we then noticed was there were loads of fires appearing over ground. They were matched by heat spots in that same area. So we were seeing active fires, but around that, we were seeing lots of heat spots, loads, all over England, over just a few day period. And it was intense. We were looking at another facility app called Open Infra Map. Now, this is a really, really useful map. Because it shows you every single transmission line, so electricity transmission line, that show you whether it's above ground or below ground, oil pipelines, gas pipelines, telecoms towers, everything you can think of. Everything you can think of. It even shows you, if you zoom into the UK, you can see where all of the turbine fields are out in the middle of the sea, the North Sea, the Irish Sea, and the Channel. You can see where the transmission cables run from the continent to the power stations in the UK, or kind of terminals in the UK. and the same with the gas and oil. And so what we noticed during this heat dome period was that a lot of these fires were happening in the same area as we would have expected underground utility tunnels to be, of one sort or another.
Yeah, I'm very interested by this. We were just sort of discussing that we had sort of similar kinds of I suppose heat activity I think it was sort of the in around sort of the 2021 sort of winter time and early 2022, where we were having sudden forest fires and fires in national parks in around February time. And
can you
that
remember, was it February? I can look for you right now.
would
I've
you
got
look
it
at
open.
Yeah, can you maybe talk us through where's coming up for and sort of spots in Ireland that are sort of highlighted? I mean, I can sort of discuss sort of where I've been hearing from sort of Cork, Cork Harbour, Kinsale, West Cork, and running up through Kerry. There was issues again in Kerry, and there was also stuff happening in Clonmel, and
Yeah.
and then on up towards in around sort of the Ballinrobe area at Lough Cara, up towards Crookpatrick.
We do see heat spots over Ireland, but we don't see as many as, and it may be because it's very, hilly and mountainous in comparison to large parts of the UK. Usually the heat spots we see, we know there's quite a lot close to the surface. So
Yeah.
I'm just scrolling through here to see if I can find anything.
Yeah,
I'll go back to 2020 because 2020 was. They might. Do you know what? I think they may have taken out the heat spots for those periods.
Wow. Well, we had well, we had fires in around those times. There was fires in around the Passage East area, and that correlated with late night Black Hawk helicopters moving up and down from Clonmel. Now, again, was that we don't have military helicopters really, so
No.
and Black Hawk helicopters, they're American issue, and there was also in around the Northern Ireland, there was sort of activity as well. It's interesting because some people in the Cork Harbour area would see Black Hawk helicopters from time to time, and they sit at a just slightly more than a 45-degree angle, literally looking straight down into the water. So they're watching what's happening in the water, and they would sit completely stationary for minutes, just looking to see what's happening in the water. So obviously, I think some people have assumed and have stated that there's a submarine base in that particular area, and there was also Cove in Cork Harbour, and there was booms there too, and also people had seen some UN tanks in around that area around that time, and also they saw the same tanks in Kerry, in West Kerry.
So I mean, I'm getting a lot of heat spots around Drogheda. Is that how you say it?
Drogheda,
north of Dublin, but there's not an awful lot because here's one near Limerick, at the mouth of the river, more or less. As it starts to widen, before it gets to Shannon, it's right at a chicane there, a bend in the river. It's tricky actually when you go back over the years. So I can see 2023 August, July, but I can't scroll per hour. I can only do in the morning or in the evening, and a lot of the time Ireland is covered in cloud.
Okay. Well, we also had sort of people in around the Wexford area and around the Ferns area had also stated there was booms. I mean, some of these booms actually took out the power, sort of even, they were so powerful that they took the electricity out. They did that.
Did it shake the ground as well?
It shook the ground. And I'm interested, I know that there's
Third, I've got some on September 3rd here. One is southwest of Cork. That's to the east of Bandon. One near Macroom. One near to the southwest of Wexford. So there are certainly ones that we can see.
And Derry is another one of these big hotspots. It's just if there's something happening anywhere, again, Cork is one of those places. I would say, probably the Dublin area, but Derry always has just a little bit more than what's happening anywhere else. It just happens to have, it seems to attract all the right people. Sort of it's a favorite holiday location for the Clinton family. So
yeah. I can see very strong line here going from north of Newry all the way down to Athlone, and then Drogheda again. So there's quite a lot. There was quite a lot going on in September in Ireland, and to the west coast as well. So yeah, it's so really what we try and do is we try and match up those heat spots with anything that's going on above ground. I know it sounds bonkers, but usually what we're finding is that we might get a really random news story that mentions a person kind of lost a child or lost a dog or did something really just odd, or somebody's complained about her chickens, and they've mentioned in great detail about an address and this and a time and and you're kind of looking at, they're going, what on earth? And then, so we make a note, and then a couple of days later, something happens in that area. So what we think is happening is that the local press definitely is being used to give the heads up to people. And we think the local press is giving the heads up to probably the bad guys, that something is coming their way.
Yeah, there seems to, look, that seems to be sort of following within the thing, because there's, you can't do all of this without it being well known in around sort of certain circles. I mean, you would need, so without going into too much details about that, but I mean, people who are listening to this will kind of, understand what we're talking about. I mean, we have, again, one of the big hot areas for activity, and it's an area that Gene Decode always mentions. Always in a worried kind of a way. He always talks about Lough Cara and Knock Airport, sort of. So, and again, it falls within. I know that you've been noticing that some of these locations, that there's always seems to be there's a correlation between where these places are and horse races. It's an interesting thing. So and this happens to be in close proximity to the horse races. So we have that also thing, but also it's an area that you'll never really have heard too much about. It was a notorious area. There was the Tuam mother and baby home, and so we have an awful lot of unresolved kind of issues with that kind of thing, which correlates again with what's going on in these places, potentially, according to Gene Decode. It's something that we just need to be looking into a bit more. So what other locations do you see? Sort of, I mean, you'd said sort of Athlone and Drogheda there. Where else is coming up for you? Just because it's interesting for people, because they're trying to sort of say, okay, what's going on here? We know that Epstein visited Ireland, and he travelled through sort of that Wexford area, travelling from Dublin down to Waterford, where his plane was waiting for him. So sort of, so it's it's just like, okay, well, we're joining the dots. So what else comes up for you, Caroline?
So, for example, on September 8th last year, I've got a line of heat spots going all the way from somewhere called Immingham and Grimsby. I don't know whether you know this. It's on the east coast of the UK. And that runs all the way across just south of Manchester to Birkenhead, Liverpool area. I think that's actually Runcorn. And then there's a heat spot just in that bay there before you get into the Irish Sea proper. And then Drogheda, you get a line, so it kind of joins at Drogheda and goes all the way across. So you've got 4 dots all the way across to a place called, so there's one just really almost underneath Carrick-on-Shannon, and then goes just in between there to Westport. So it's almost like an entire line of heat spots traveling from the East UK to the west of Ireland, which is incredible.
Yeah,
I have seen that one before, but not as complete as that.
Yeah, GC code actually talks about that. He talks about that's the line that goes from Knock to England. He also says that there's a line that runs from Dublin to Galway, as well. And there's a line that I think there's also something that possibly runs from Dublin, across too. So,
yeah, Anglesey probably. Yeah. So this whole area, this central area of the UK and the northern part of Ireland proper, is always busy. You know, particularly in England, it's always busy, and you know, we have a lot of people who are based around the sorry, I'm just going to look the names. So Liverpool, Blackpool area, Blythe, I think it's called, Ellesmere Port, Cheshire, that kind of area. And they are constantly getting clobbered and always have terrible, terrible air quality.
and can I just, sorry. So whenever you're talking about Dublin, but can you also talk about what's happening in Ulster in Northern Ireland? Because we know that it would have probably a bigger presence in terms of sort of the whole military establishment. I mean, sort of people would know that there's that there's just historically there's just been an awful lot more military sort of.
Well, we don't really see an awful lot going on in Northern Ireland. Well, in terms of enemy activity, we see a lot going on in the Irish Sea. I think the most over the last, since World War I, since flight started, and particularly military flight, a lot of effort and research has gone in worldwide, both with the Allies and with our adversaries, into understanding how to use weather patterns, wind flows, and humidity, dryness, all of that, to use those conditions to spread substances more effectively, whether that's for weather model, whether it's something more nefarious. And we see a lot of activity in the Irish Sea. We see a lot of hugging the coast, because there is the Atlantic stream, which is part of the jet stream. We call it the Atlantic stream, brings in a lot of lightning from West Atlantic and America, and Sargasso Sea. So that lightning is actually quite dangerous for anybody in the air, especially if you've been exposed to any kind of toxin. It doesn't have to necessarily be arsenic, but any toxin that you have in your system will oscillate with radiation, ionizing radiation. And one bolt of lightning I'm not even sure if they've managed to work out how much radiation comes off one bolt of lightning, but enough to kind of, I suppose, feel it. If you get a bolt of lightning near you, you certainly do feel it, don't you? You feel the energy of it. But if you then multiply that by, I don't know, 10,000 bolts of lightning, which you might see for sure in the ocean, then that can become quite dangerous, for people flying. For example, I've got a screen up here. This is what we do. We use an app called Blitz Auto. It's a German app, actually. It's very useful. And I take a 48-hour cumulative shot of how many lightning strikes we've seen in a certain area or continent in that 48-hour period. And we are always seeing, and particularly at the moment, we're seeing a very strong stream of lightning coming in from the southwest Atlantic, and that will be affecting Southern Ireland, where you are, Cornwall, the west of France, Spain as well. I don't know whether you've heard that Spain has reintroduced masks in some areas. And also what I noticed, which I'd never seen before, never seen the correlation, basically because I hadn't looked, because I didn't think there would be one, is that when we've had this heavy lightning, because it's not always there, but when we have had it, I'm seeing a slight rise, not a dangerous rise, but a slight rise in the general radiation reading over the areas that are receiving the most lightning signatures, we call them. And so, for example, at the moment, the northwest of Spain and Portugal are quite high, a lot higher than the areas further inland. But they're not high to dangerous levels. I must, kind of reiterate that. But if you imagine that, when you have chemo and then you go for radiation, you don't get completely blasted with radiation, but they work together synergistically. So the chemical might be a relatively small dose and might not make you so unwell. And this isn't how all chemo and radiotherapy works, but some does. So they kind of piggyback off each other. So you get the chemical into the body wherever the tumor is, and then you blast it with radiation, and pop goes the tumor over time. And it takes a course, doesn't it, to kind of achieve that effect. And that's in a similar way when you're inhaling toxins, and then you are being exposed to low-level radiation like this, like ionizing radiation. It becomes cumulative over time. And this is why people don't all get sick at the same time, because they have different exposures, different sized bodies. Some people go out running a lot and other people don't. Some people sweat a lot, some people don't. And, depending on what you're eating as well. So it really is highly dependent on how much you're exposed. But usually what we find, as we all know, we get our seasonal cleanse, don't we, where we have a cold or a flu once or twice a year and we feel a lot better afterwards. And that's really the body just reacting to everything that it's been bombarded with over the year, whether that's in food or water or whatever, and then deciding that it's had enough and it wants to check it all out.
Wow. Well, we see some unusual, weather patterns. I mean, we increasingly so. We see sort of the thunder and lightning. Was it over Christmas time? We had thunder and lightning sort of storms, and it was just like, how is this happening? Sort of in the middle of winter,
Yes.
So and it's we sort of see these things that sort of defy kind of reason, and yet we're looking at this. I mean, we were just mentioning that. Was it the Iceland had the volcano there a few weeks ago, and just to correlate with that, we had purple skies over South Kilkenny, which kind of looked like, as Archaics would call it, he would call it the vapor barrier. Sort of that's what it looked like. It was a very deep, healing kind of a purple. So, but yeah, I think we're just being exposed to ever increasing sort of weather manipulation, if we can say that word.
Yes,
I mean, certainly at the I sort of fairly close to the coast, so so I would sort of see the planes coming over, and actually I was standing out and looking up, and you would see them just turning on the tanks, as they're coming over. And I was looking out, looking up at this guy, and he was, as he was flying towards sort of me, I was looking up, and there was no trails, and then suddenly he turned on the taps, and I was literally, I could look up and I could see this guy, and he was looking at me, and he actually turned off the taps. you know, you know, he and he flew on, and then and
Yeah,
then he
yeah.
opened the caps again. So so yeah, I mean it's
So
I mean I've yeah, I know some pilots and they say, look, this is real, so it is. But you've been doing I mean, you really go to town with regards to this. I mean, there's some um ladies up in Donegal have been doing soil testing and they've been doing water testing, and they're getting a lot of the same results as what you're getting. Is they're getting an awful lot of arsenic in the soil samples. It's like, this doesn't make sense, because it
yeah,
just so happens that we did soil tests in this area, and we took it down to have these chemically assessed and petrographical analysis on these soils 20 years ago. So we know exactly what was happening in our soils and in our groundwater in this area. And now we go back and we take a sample of the same area, and now we're getting this plethora of damaging chemicals. I mean, where are they coming from? So so they're
what else
getting.
are you finding? What else are you finding apart from arsenic?
I don't. They actually have the whole details. They produced all of the data, so that's all available. So but
Yeah,
I've noticed that you've also been. I think they also found an awful lot of aluminium and sort of things like that, things that are sort of
yeah,
toxins and things that are fairly nasty. But
yeah,
you've been doing this, and you've even been taking hair samples. I've been sort
yeah.
of watching that even your pets are getting sick because they're maybe drinking from puddles, and they're that are contaminated. So I mean, what's coming up for you, Caroline, with regards to this, and you're charting also the health and well-being of yourselves and also of the animals.
Yeah, I try to be quite specific. We are constantly asking questions of people, and it must get irritating for some of the members of the emergency news channel, because they're like, oh no, she's asking again. But it's because what we do is we test the theory time and time again to make sure we're not wrong. And so, for example, I put one out just a couple of days ago, yesterday I think it was, saying we are expecting people to have sore eyes, and I was very specific: sore eyes, headache that kind of won't shift, like it feels like you've got a headache behind your eyes, but it's not like a proper headache, it feels like your sinuses are dry, um, and also a little, maybe a cough or a little bit of nausea. And the number of people who came back and said their eyes were sore was incredible, and in the areas that we were expecting it. And we only track what we believe to be spreading arsine gas, which is the gas form of arsenic. So the fact that there is that kind of tight correlation between our observations in the air and our observations of weather patterns, and that is then coming back to us in the form of real feedback of, yes, we have that, we have that, we have that. The only confusing thing there is that, for example, I got lots of people saying, oh, the Southwest. And I was like, hang on, we don't have anything in the Southwest. And then as soon as I look at the lightning map, there it is. So the lightning will make you feel like you're getting that real-time exposure, because it's shaking everything up in your body and in your eyes and in your head. So everything that you were exposed to like last week or the week before, that's still there and hasn't been gotten rid of, will then react with the radiation coming off the lightning. So it can feel like you're having the same reaction even though you're just being exposed to lightning. So it's like releasing arsenic all over again into your body, into your bloodstream, and then you have to go through that. Either you detox it or your body tucks it away somewhere to keep you safe or relatively safe. So we've done a lot of hair testing. I did test my dogs. I do think that perhaps one of my neighbors didn't like my dogs barking so much. So they had a lot of lithium in them, a lot of lithium. I really don't think that that is anything that is being sprayed on us, because it's not in any other samples. So I do think that was an attempt at poisoning the dogs, which is a shame. But I can discount that as something that we are experiencing overhead. Then the other thing that I ask people to tell me is whether or not they've had aluminium back in their tests. The ones that I'm seeing, only the dogs tend to have a little higher than normal levels, but they don't run into the dangerous levels. And these are, we're talking micrograms here, really very, very small amounts. And as soon as people stop the dogs drinking puddle water, that should go. So to give people an idea of how much metal might be used in cloud making, silver iodide, which is seeded into cloud base to make rain, you can, a whole teaspoon of silver iodide, so it's like kind of looks like a bit like mercury, I presume. I don't know, I've not seen it. A whole teaspoon of that, flat level teaspoon, creates 1 trillion ice nuclei. 1 trillion. I mean, I don't know how much cloud that would be, but that's, it sounds impressive, doesn't it? So it's a lot of cloud particles for not much metal. Now, how cloud particles are formed is what I think people are getting a bit confused about, because you can have ice crystals that form just spontaneously, and they don't need an ice nuclei. They just form spontaneously where there is a lot of moisture in the air and heat. So you would see trails out of the back of aircraft just that were flying in an area that was a little bit more moisture laden than another area. And then it looks like it's turning it off, but it's not. And then there's the other type of ice nuclei that is formed around a particle. So you get a tiny particle of sulfur or soot, for example, from the emissions from a plane, and that will form a little ice crystal around the particle itself. And so that is what forms the trails that look like they're coming out of the bottoms of aircraft. And absolutely, undoubtedly, there is the potential for adding a little bit of this. You know how they have additives in car fuel, that you could add a bit, take away a bit, in order to get a mix that would produce something a bit more long lasting. Whether or not they have separate nozzles, I have no idea. For this stuff, I think certainly the very large cargo planes that we see churning the stuff out, undoubtedly they probably have their own separate dispersal systems. But you can get trails that last and expand from just normal aircraft fuel, from what I can tell from the research that I've looked at, based on that science around how ice crystals form.
Yeah, I mean, I would see like a silvery haze, and it used to be that you would see a haze on sort of in certain kind of weather conditions, in sort of in agricultural areas, maybe sort of in around sort of harvest time, you would get there just be sort of that lovely kind of a golden kind of a haze, but now it's a silvery haze, and it could happen at any time of the year, but it's just odd,
That's
and
yeah.
yeah, and
I can tell you exactly what that is.
go ahead, tell me what is
Luckily,
that? Yeah.
we've had 2 people, somebody very kindly from a kind of an official lab tested some dust that somebody had, and that largely contained silica. And then Owen Morgan, who'd done the tests that he then posted up on Instagram, that had the 44 parts per million arsenic in, he picked up a whole bunch of other stuff, which is kind of pretty normal because, he's a soil guy, so he knows, soil and water guy. So he said that usually there's quite a lot of silica in these tests that he was doing, and he'd done another test earlier of snow, and that also showed silica. So silica, we think, is being used as a binding agent for the gas. So it would be silica dioxide, probably. I don't know, might just be silica plain. because arsine gas is one atom of arsine with 3 hydrogens. And so it binds really easily to anything with an oxygen, really easily. It doesn't bind permanently, though. So there's a lot of chemistry behind how arsine works. The most successful binding for arsenic in general is sulfur. And this is why it's so interesting seeing these big clouds of sulfur float around the Earth. The last one was near the Kamchatka volcano in eastern Russia. We don't know whether that cloud actually came from Russia. It may not have done. It may have been dispersed and just kind of launched into the jet stream. But in theory, what happens when you bind 2 sulfur molecules to an arsenic is that the bind it's like a double bond, so it's stronger than a simple bond like to oxygen, hydrogen to oxygen, or what. I'm not a chemist, I think you can tell, and I don't have my notes with me on all of this, but it is fascinating when you start digging deep into it. But anyway, so the sulfur, 2 sulfurs binds very strongly to arsenic, and this is why arsenic is such a brilliant kind of killing tool, because all of our enzymes that govern the things that happen in our bodies, so the enzymes are like the worker bees of a hive. They kind of take this and take that and kind of make it into something else, or get your synapses working, or kind of dissolve something that shouldn't be there, or make something else that your body needs. And without these enzymes, so even enzymes that we digest with are being affected. Without these enzymes, or without enough of these enzymes working, either the body overcompensates and produces much, much, much more of them, and then you kind of end up with an overload of X protein or enzyme, or it doesn't produce enough of them, and your body just kind of goes, I need to digest my food. I can't. I've now got, indigestion. So these particles that we're talking about, going back to those, it is actually what they do is allow us to physically see what is going on in the sky. So, as I said before, arsine gas can't be sprayed in cloud because that would just wreck the whole point of spraying it. It is absorbed easily by water, and then it would kind of stay up in the cloud and it wouldn't fall down for us all to breathe. So instead, if you disperse something like silica in very fine milled form, so in microns, so you're talking about very small, PM2.5 it's called, so it's smaller than or the same size as 2.5 microns, so it's really tiny. You can't see it in the naked eye. You might be able to see a little bit of a reflection of a particle in the sun, but I'm not sure. Probably. You know how it looks when you're looking out of the window and it's a sunny day and you've just shaken a towel and you've got lots of particles flying around in the air. So what then happens is that PM 2.5 becomes visible to us. We can see the thick haze over the ground. It's kind of grey and pink, and the visibility drops as well. So you can really see that there's something in the air that probably you don't want to be breathing an awful lot of. So I certainly recommend to everybody that I talk to who does activity outside, like running or cycling, not to go when they can see this stuff on the horizon. And you do have to look on the horizon. You can't see it, when you walk out of the door, it's invisible. You have to look on the horizon, a few miles into the distance at least, to see what the visibility is like, to get an idea of how dense the air is. And we use apps for that as well. I'll come to that in a minute. But the most important thing, the most impressive thing that we've seen as part of countermeasures by the Allies is the use of weather modification. So obviously somebody is dropping this silica and sulfur or whatever to bind this so that it can be seen, but also so that it can be drawn off land and into the sea. So as soon as we start to see that PM 2.5 dropping, we know that the system is cleaning out and that the air quality is going to get better. And without fail, people start to feel better as soon as that cloud moves, as soon as that haze moves.
Just on that actually, as you're saying, sort of with regards to the weather being sort of moved off the land, the local beaches here, occasionally we would get this black or grey dust, carbon,
Yes.
on the beach, and it's such an odd thing. I think people were using magnets, and they were finding that some of this dust was actually magnetic. Interestingly, also, I was talking to Miles about this conversation, and he's just back from Norway, and he's saying that, that there was a big fall of snow, but it wasn't like real snow. It wasn't as cold, and we've even seen pictures of people setting fire to some of the snowballs. It's bizarre to see, but and over and above that, it just I'll also raise the issue that I also think that there's a legislative issue here too, because also our groundwaters are being polluted. Whenever sort of farmers are being allowed to use very strong weed killers that actually have a residue that sort of live within or damage our gut, but also stay in the groundwaters and pollute the groundwaters with fertilizers, and more so with certain weed killers. Not, I don't want to highlight any particular weed killer, but I'm sure everybody will know who I'm talking about. But that was allowed to happen, and it's polluted our groundwaters, and we don't know. I mean, it's not going to happen in the next 200 or 300 years that our groundwaters are going to clear, having this chemical in them.
Yeah, I know the one you mean.
Yeah.
But I have my thoughts about this, and Seb Powell, who did a lot of research with me last year and the year before, he's done some analysis, and basically the action of that chemical is to dry out grains. So it dries stuff out. Now, what we've found is that most plant life, pretty much all plant life, are amazing remediators of soil. So if you grow a bunch of sunflowers in a field for a few years, your soil is going to be beautiful as long as you don't put any crap on it. Now, what I think is happening with this particular type of chemical, is that they're called desiccants. And when a plant grows, it starts to suck up nutrients from the soil, doesn't it? And it sucks up heavy metals and whatever else is in the soil that shouldn't be. And as it starts to flower, so for flowering plants, it then gives out, in our case, we're talking about arsenic, it would start to give out arsine gas, which is why an awful lot of councils, for example, will start chopping down all of their wild flowers quite early in the season. So they'll cut all of those down, because if they keep them and let them keep flowering continuously, which weeds often do, and wildflowers, they will just be pumping arsine back into the environment, which is not what we want. So the action, what I think is happening with this type of chemical, is that when a plant dries, so let's forget that chemical for the moment. When a plant dries, it's losing water, and arsine and arsenic are water soluble. So when you lose the water, you suck the water out of it by any means. So it could be natural drying in the sun, or it could be, mechanical drying via chemical or drying machine. You're removing all the water, but along with the water, you're removing quite a bit of arsine and arsenic. And I think that is what this type of treatment is designed for. So there are rumors that that chemical contains arsenic, but if you test treated plants, of course you're going to find arsenic anyway, and any runoff will also show arsenic, but that does not mean to say that that chemical contains it. It's more likely that that chemical is drawing it out of the plant as it desiccates and then carries it away in the groundwater. And I do totally agree with you that we shouldn't be adding any chemicals to the groundwater at all, or the soil or our plants. But we have a big problem at the moment in that remediation of some sort has to happen. So bar not eating anything grown in soil that isn't undercover or completely cleaned and then undercover, we're not going to be able to grow anything. I mean, that's, I grow my own vegetables here when I can. I grew fairly well in the first season. There was a blight on the potatoes, but I had good tomatoes. But then after that winter, so last year, I tried to grow again and everything failed. Everything. Literally everything. Didn't treat the soil, didn't put anything on it, didn't cover it over. It got rainwater. Wrecked, completely wrecked, and everybody in my area said the same.
And why do you think that it failed? Was it because what was in the rainwater, or was it the temperature, or was it sometimes whenever you're growing, if there's a cold spell, that'll just take it out? Sort of what do you know? What sort of aided to the failure?
Weather conditions. It was normal weather conditions. There wasn't anything unusual that I would go, oh, you need to cover it over. I did have the area covered over whilst it was still frosty, so everything was nice and cozy, but as soon as I took it off and it started getting rainwater and then it got exposed to lightning, so we had a couple of lightning storms in that early growing period, so rain first, then lightning, then rain, then lightning, it just wrecked it all of it. Never seen anything like it.
Jeez. You have sort of, that sounds like my kind of gardening skills. I've got I've got green-fingered friends, sort of I'm sort of in awe of them, but I'm afraid that's generally sort of my how things are sort of working out for me. But yeah, I think that's something that that's quite alarming. It's something that a lot of people are seeing. Everybody had a bad growing year last year, and then whenever, and these things, is what you and I are both seeing, is these things they're not accidental. Sort of the fact that everybody had a bad growing year, that wasn't by accident. Also the fact that people had a very bad harvest last year, again, that wasn't by accident. There was only a few people that were savvy enough, got the first cut for cutting of hay, and other than above that, there was no hay cut last year. So it puts everybody, all the agricultural people, into sort of a kind of a panic situation. So, I mean, this is a tough winter. If we have a prolonged, or if we have a heavy snow, we're really going to be very badly affected because of what happened last spring and last summer, because we just don't have the fodder to take us through. So, but also even what was happening in terms of what's going into the agri feeds, and they're putting in GMO, soya, and so forth, and all of these additives that are just sort of very questionable into the likes of the fodder. So, is there anything else you want to cover in this?
Yeah,
we have.
I can tell you about GMO, but it isn't what you're expecting to hear.
Okay, and what is it then? So what are your thoughts about GMO?
So I said that. So we've done quite a bit of research on foods, and obviously this disulfide bond, which I talked about, which is the double sulfur bond, which is present in everything organic, is very attractive to arsenic. So basically, the more disulfide bonds a food crop has, the more likely it is to absorb arsenic. So some of the most prolific disulfide bridge harborers of all the plants are things like wheat and soya. And basically the genetic modification is trying to edit out some of that disulfide content, so that there's less for the arsenic to get hold of and the plant becomes less toxic to us. So whether or not that's working, I have no idea. I can't eat soya personally or wheat. But that is the theory behind why they're genetic, we believe is the theory behind the genetic modification. But if you look at remediation plants, so if you look at all the experiments for remediation plants with arsenic, you'll see that wheat is included and soya and various other plants that you would perhaps not expect to see.
Well, my experience, I'm like you, sort of I can't eat wheat. And there's certain other sort of things that I would have an issue with. And what people are sort of finding now is actually that chemical, that wheat killing chemical that we're not going to mention, that also affects people's gut. It was the same, the chemical sort of reacts to people's gut. So whenever people are thinking that they have a wheat or a gluten intolerance, they're reacting to that chemical. So we're seeing with some of these GMOs, inside of their practices, I've sort of witnessed myself that they would have some sort of a thought pattern that that sort of to modify what's natural gives you exponential growth. But actually, one of the things that we're finding is those non-native plants actually seem to be a lot more exposed to blight. They seem to be a lot more exposed to kind of predators and risk factors and weather issues as well. Whereas sort of the native plants and seeds, heirloom seeds, seem to be a lot more sort of resistant to sort of temperature fluctuations, or so that's something that sort of some of the organic people, the biodynamic people are finding. And I mean, as I said, I'd love to be a little bit more green fingered, but that's what they've assured me, that seems to be the case. But also nutrient value, that these heirloom seeds seems to have a higher nutrient value than something that is GMO, that is aimed to produce bigger quantities faster, and changing the growing characteristics of the plant to produce bigger yields. But of course, then to produce the bigger yields, they'll also need to have the sort of additive fertilizers and so forth put on. So it seems to use an awful lot more energy, as opposed to sort of the more natural native seeds that we can sort of find from places like Seed Savers.
Yeah, I think
So,
the issue that large growers have, is that if they have a failed crop, hundreds of people will not get the food that they need. The market won't get the food that they need. And I also question, actually, looking at the way the buying is going for the foodstuffs. The buying is going for different foodstuffs, like I don't know, green beans. Let's say green beans. If you go to the store, you will see that a lot of the green beans might come from Kenya, not from the UK, even in the spring, when you might expect there to be green beans from the UK. But the reason they're not coming from the UK is because they're not edible. They're not edible, and probably the crops are failing. So I also believe that a lot of the crops that we're getting are perhaps being destroyed. So I'm thinking about winter wheat, remediation plants are perhaps being destroyed, and we are bringing in a lot more food than we quite realize, because they are not fit for consumption. Now, in terms of, your comment about the chemical that everybody knows we're talking about, kind of being the element that is hurting people's guts, I would ask, has that grain that has been treated with that chemical been tested for arsenic before it is desiccated? Because then I would say I would look first at arsenic every single time before I look at any chemical that's being used, purely because whilst I wouldn't really necessarily even want to eat anything that's been treated with a chemical, I think that we're all, I, like you, was thinking, oh well, it's gluten in the wheat that's causing the problem. Oh no, now it's the chemical in that chemical in the wheat that's causing the problem. And now I'm pretty sure that it's actually neither of those, and that it is probably arsenic, because I get those symptoms whether I eat wheat or not, depending on what is going on in the air.
That's a big, big statement. That's something that we can all look into, and because that's a massive statement, Caroline. And yeah, wow. Well, that
Yeah.
kind of makes sense. I mean, if we're looking into the skies and that's what we see, and I mean, I look across and I see that the silvery haze is in the skies, it's and this is a growing kind of an area. So yeah, that correlates. So we that's something to look into. Okay, so look, thank you very much for covering those issues. Um, we're hearing about people talking about the event. Do you have any thoughts about what this event is? I mean, we hear about the elites are all scurrying to their bunkers. They're talking about sort of this year. Do you have any thoughts about this? I mean, some people are talking about Robert Anton Wilson's book, The Illuminati Trilogy, and the Hidden Army Under the Lake. But what are your thoughts about sort of the status quo at the moment? Are we going to have an event, do you think, this year?
It's how long is a piece of string? I think the big issue we have, and you've probably noticed this yourself, is that there are still a lot of people who are not even prepared to start listening to any, even for example, what we've talked about tonight, which is fairly technical. And I have more or less the theory covered. But the people just will not consider it. Even the people who are awake in the awake category will not talk about it. The whistleblowers won't talk about it at all. We don't know why. And the thing is, until people start talking just about the simplest things, about what is going on in our air, and really being open to knowing the answer rather than kind of picking something that they think is popular, a reason that is popular, then we're going to be held in this limbo where nothing is changing. People are not waking up properly because they're refusing to budge from a point of view. And every time, we analyze every day, we learn new stuff every day, we don't stop learning. But what I do think, in answer to your question, getting back on track, is that this is a war. We are seeing the war pop up above the surface, first in Ukraine, and then in the West, I mean, Ukraine, and then in Israel. This is the war in the West, the visual reminder of what is going on. But then there is a huge war, if you look at Zoom Earth, running right across the center of Africa. And there are people dying of goodness knows what viruses, in inverted commas, with lightning and arsenic probably in various doses. There are rebel factions threatening to kill people in Papua New Guinea, scores of animals dying all over the world from the sea, whales being stranded, elephants dying in the Sahara, Sahara, they don't have elephants in the Sahara, but in Africa, puffins off the coast of Skye. All of this is happening all around us, and people are not ready. The whole world is not ready to hear this, because it is beyond everyone's imagination. It is beyond the scope of what we thought was possible. It's taken 4 years for us to really start feeling comfortable talking about this in this kind of detail. And even now, it's still very, very cursory and probably quite vague for some people. So in terms of, there has been some discussion about there possibly being a call for a nuclear fallout or a lockdown of some description. And since we've started to work out how this activity in the air is being literally circulated all around the world in these jet streams, we can see how it might be possible to predict another lockdown type scenario, but they would have to really come up with something interesting for people to listen. So nuclear fallout. But then there is always going to be this section of society who are just, number one, not going to believe it, going to think it's all bunkum because they've never been ill and, stuff like that. So I think, no, is my answer. No, I don't think it's going to happen this year. I don't think it is that kind of war. I think this is going to be a long, protracted, slow learning war that, could go on for some years.
That's interesting. I've heard these concepts such as the fluoride stare. Whenever you're talking to somebody and they're looking at you like you're speaking a different language, and some people would joke that maybe there's too much fluoride in their water, so there's maybe something in that. But even the likes of the 5G and all of this, but we've been completely encompassed by mockingbird media. It's basically like narcissism. People we're seeing this kind of behavior that we would associate with narcissism. It's pathological lying, where they are looking straight into your eyes with conviction, saying there's nothing going on here. And only if you've ever had to deal, unfortunate enough to have had to deal with a narcissist, then you'll actually say, we know what this is now. But otherwise, people just don't have any concept of sort of why would the government lie to us? Why would the media lie to us? Where they haven't actually gotten to that point yet. People that are, it's a tough thing for them to have to deal with, the fact that there are people out there that actually just want to take advantage. It seems to be linked to we have terms like Mephistopheles. We have Jason Horsley, who's going to be joining us in the next few days. And he talks about the Fabian agenda. His family we're a Fabian family going back more than 100 years, the times of Aldous Huxley. And literally they drafted all of this out more than 100 years ago, and this is part of their game plan. So but whenever you can go back and you can look at this literature, because they have it all written down, and then you sort of, okay, this is what this is. As I said, if we look at the writings of Robert Anton Wilson, if you look at the writings of C.S. Lewis, Aldous Huxley, H.G. Wells, we have there's a plethora of authors which we actually just sort of talk about their terms. We have 1984 that was written by George Orwell. It was in our common thought for, it was in school syllabuses. So it was preemptive planning, that we were sort of taught all of this whole syllabus, so we could we would walk into it, even though we would be sort of ridiculing it, sort of, well, we're not going to behave like that. It's even all of this talk about racism and predictive planning and so forth. And actually, the people that have been sort of, rebelling the most and sort of saying, no, we wouldn't fall for that, are actually the ones that are leading they're leading the way. They're the ones they're showing the Pied Piper the way. So, but it's interesting to see how it's all working out. So, but look, Caroline, thank you so much for joining us. Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with us?
Yes, Josie, I do. So you've talked about reading a number of authors, and I do think that that is important, but I think at the same time we must remember that propaganda is embodied in fiction, easily embodied in fiction. And what I am doing at the moment is spending a lot of time raking back over history, because I think there are not history that's been written up by somebody. I'm talking about going back to somebody's diary. So, for example, Kaiser Wilhelm of the German Empire, or Kurt Prüfer he was a spy for Germany in the Middle East. Somebody called Philby, St. John Philby, who was actually the father of Kim Philby, who was part of the Cambridge 5 spy ring, who defected to Russia. There are a lot of people from that period, from the mid-1800s to post-World War, who have left a legacy of documentation and writings and thoughts, not all of them honest, obviously, because there are diaries, but then what you do is you compare what one of those people thinks of another person. So, for example, St. John Philby, who was very kind of attached himself to Ibn Saud, who was the king of Saudi around the time of the Palestine Mandate, he saw Lawrence as a little man. And so this is Lawrence of Arabia. And we all have this impression that Lawrence of Arabia is this big hulking man who kind of rides through on his charger through, the Arabian desert. But he's this little man. So what it does is it puts, if you compare all of these people's writings, you get to see what the reality was at the time. So I'm learning about, another guy called Minor Targan, and this is the article I'm on at the moment. And he worked in Palestine for the British. He was a colonel when he arrived there. He was posted actually in Gaza, interestingly. But you don't just look at that tiny period of time as well. You look at what he did before and what he did afterwards. And he has a very German name. And you look at his family, and they come originally a few generations back from Bremen in Germany, but they're not finished with Bremen. So some people kind of just travel and kind of land somewhere and forget about the country they came from, as a lot of immigrants did. But this guy, he has family in Bremen. They have a bank in Bremen, and they have a bank in London. And then after he's done his little stint in the Middle East, he writes diaries, the Middle East diary, where he claims that he actually met Hitler 3 times, and he was working for the British. Could he have been a spy? Do you see what I mean? So it's all of these intertwined people and accounts of things that you can compare to each other, which in my view is absolutely enthralling. It's something that makes me quite excited, because I think this is the real history. This is this archive.org that we now have, that I owe an awful lot to my research to, is just like a treasure trove of information. You can't find everything, but you find a lot. So I highly recommend that people use resources like that to further their, the facts. They're learning of the actual facts of things.
What is that archive called? What they're saying is literally that it only just concluded in the last couple of years, and that we lost, and that the Allied forces lost. So
It's
because, and
still
then there's
going.
state. Yeah, and they're saying that Operation Paperclip was evidence of that.
Yeah, I think the war is still going. I don't think it actually stopped.
What was that's interesting. What was the name of the archive that you were talking about,
It's
Caroline?
the Internet Archive, and
Yeah.
the web address is archive.org. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
So what I recommend people do is not put that in, because it's got the Wayback Machine. It's quite difficult to search. So what I do is I find a person that I want to know more about. So let's say St. John Philby, and I put him in, and then I put Middle East, because I want to know about when he was in the Middle East, and then archive.org on the end, and then it will find everything on him.
Is we could have a whole big conversation about this, because it takes us into sort of those literature experts that I have a bit of a graw for, the likes of C.S. Lewis. So C.S. Lewis wrote. He seemed to have had a connection with this. He would have been on this was the Allied side. He's from Belfast, but he wrote books about the abolition of man. He was fighting against what the Fabians were doing, sort of, and he kind of moved into very sort of Christian kind of ways of thinking. But he wrote a very interesting book, Caroline, called That Hidden Strength. And it was the likes of James Tunney sort of puts it as being one of the most important books, because it kind of echoes where we're at the moment. So he says that C.S. Lewis has it that Merlin is sleeping, and that there is like an invasion of the NICE, which is sort of, apparently it's the same term that's used by England for one of their new bodies, and it's that it comes over and basically it invades the whole area. It's narcissism explosion, and so Merlin sort of awakes from his sleep, because he knows that this is going to happen, to save the country by sort of basically giving people their sovereignty back, sort of. And so these are interesting kind of archetypes that seem to be sort of coming up at the moment. But yeah, I think C.S. Lewis would have been in that Oxford set and sort of in around that mix, but he would have been on the other side, sort of on the good side. But the likes of Jason Horsley, he would talk about sort of the D.H. Lawrence, and he would have been on the other side of the coin. So it's very interesting to sort of see this whole mix of conversation, and it's interesting how they're all geographically so connected, and around the same time period. We had a very interesting man called Bob Osborne, who wrote a book called Zenner, and Zenner is in Cornwall. It's on the peninsula there, and again, it was attracting all of these Fabians and all of these occultists, and they were sort of working on this whole situation. He likens the whole thing and connects it all with what would be called the secret space program, and all of that, sort of what's happening in the tunnels. So this is all connected, and it has been connected for many for many years. Even at that time, was it Carl Jung, the German philosopher, and the Germans were very interested in that particular area of Cornwall, because Hitler was thinking about sort of getting a property there, as was Carl Jung, because of its connections to this whole sort of occultism. So they're massive conversations, and I seem to be just going round and round in circles with it, because it just keeps going back to the same places over and over again. So, but I'm also interested in how some little places, little pockets of places seem to just keep coming up with, in around the same time period, lots of inspiration. It's like your heat spots, but it's with like sort of, it's a genus loci, it's with inspiration. Where C.S. Lewis was born just happened to be where a guy called was Harland and Wolff had their properties. So they were the shipbuilders that built the Titanic. And of course then C.S. Lewis is changing the world with his writing and his stories at the same time as or sort of slightly after, Harland and Wolff had built the ships that would change the world. I mean, sort of the all of the bankers sort of going down in the Titanic and the changing of the gold system. I mean, there's no such thing as coincidence really anymore. But these are sort of people that are geographically located that have changed the world by their actions, either directly or indirectly.
Yeah, amazing, isn't it?
Isn't it? It
Really.
really is.
And
Mhm.
it is, we, as you're saying about things going on around certain people's houses, we've seen interesting stuff going on over and underneath some famous people's houses. I won't go into details.
So, do you know, I didn't even ask you. What is I've seen some images of things happening over people's properties and aerial phenomena. We're talking, Gene Decode calls them airquakes. He says it's like, it's maybe sort of people, it's maybe UAPs or uh, energetics, sort of in the air. So what are your own thoughts? I mean, you're also saying that it's energetics being
No, we
explosive.
don't tend to. Some people have experienced what they feel is an energy wave, but that could be connected to weaponry underground. It could be connected to weaponry overhead, but usually we think that the Allies, well, most of the active fighting goes on in the night, so we wouldn't be awake to experience it. And I think that's deliberate. I think that is to keep us safe. I have heard some very strange noises at night, some very kind of Star Warsy type noises at night. But then also, I think there is signal blockers type interference that is regularly used with militaries, that they can actually fly over an area and stop you being able to kind of contact somebody on a mobile phone, for example. And that is just really, I think, to protect their location. And that's something we're really mindful of. If we see some of the Allies in the sky but can't see them on radar, we don't disclose that at all, because they're off radar for a reason. So, but apart from that, no. In terms of energy waves, we do sometimes, certainly some people are feeling stuff from underground, but overground, no.
That's interesting. That echoes kind of what we sort of see over here in Ireland. I mean, it's interesting. There was a couple. Yeah, there was a couple that flew over from the US Navy, and of course, you kind of you just know the different sounds of the different engines, and whether they flew over, and I think was it whenever I heard the noise, I said that's not a normal plane. So I went in and checked the whole thing, and I noticed that it was two planes that they were sort of flying in formation from West Cork up to Dublin, and they were obviously looking for parts, and because they came from an aircraft carrier. So it was so it was interesting, because whenever I was watching that, there was something like 3 or 4 thousand other people that obviously had heard the planes and noticed that's not a normal plane. So there was like 3,000 other people also monitoring the whole situation. So we all knew exactly where they're going.
Yeah, there are in situations like that when they're flying very low, people do notice, but we tend to just try and keep anything off our research channel, just because we don't know who's on it. Basically, we have a channel of 2,500 people, and we have no idea if we've got anybody in there who's not meant to be in there, because, how do you know? You don't know.
Yeah, very responsible. Okay, look, Caroline, any final thoughts?
No, that's it, I think, Josie. Thank you very much for having me. It's been fascinating hearing your stuff as well.
It's been a great share. Thank you very much. I hope everybody's sort of enjoying this, and also gives everybody the opportunity to go and do their own research and learn from this, and put this education sort of basically to use to see, look, what can we work out from here, and basically it's all about sort of sovereignty of how can we use this knowledge to see what's going on in our local environment. So look, thank you so much for joining us, Caroline.
It's a pleasure, Josie. Take care.
Thank you.